The Hermit of Shadow Creek. In the 1930s, deep in the wilderness of northern British Columbia, near a place locals called Shadow Creek, an old hermit lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin. His name was Ephraim Crow, and though he rarely ventured into town, his presence loomed like a shadow over the community. Ephraim was a man of wiry frame and a face like cracked leather, with eyes that glinted strangely in the firelight when he came to trade furs and odd trinkets for supplies. The people of the nearby town of Cedar Hollow whispered about him often. Some said he'd fled a dark past. Others claimed he was touched by something unnatural. He always seemed to know things he shouldn't, things about people, their lives, and even their futures. What unnerved the townsfolk most, however, was that Ephraim never aged. No matter how many years passed, he looked exactly the same, stooped, wiry, and always accompanied by a faint, unsettling grin. But the truth about Ephraim Crow was far darker than anyone could imagine. Ephraim was no ordinary hermit. He wasn't even human. It began when a prospector named Clive Mathers arrived in Cedar Hollow one summer, chasing rumours of gold in the northern hills. Clive was a brash young man, quick with a smile and quicker with a boast. When he heard about Ephraim, he was immediately intrigued. The locals told him to leave the hermit alone, but Clive was the kind of man who couldn't resist a good story. They say he's cursed, an old logger warned him in the town saloon. Living out there all alone, like the forest itself, keeps him company. Cursed, you say? Clive smirked. Maybe he's hiding something. Maybe he's got gold stashed away in that cabin of his. The bartender leaned in, lowering his voice. He's not right, that one. Folks disappear when they go poking round his place. Best leave him be. Clive, of course, ignored the warnings. The next morning, he packed his mule and headed out towards Shadow Creek. After 2 days of hard travel, Clive found the cabin. It sat in a clearing at the base of a ridge, surrounded by dense forest and an unnatural stillness. The cabin itself was small and ramshackle, its walls patched with moss and bark, its windows dark and lifeless. As Clive approached, he felt a strange sense of unease, as though the forest were watching him. The air seemed thicker here, heavy with an otherworldly presence. Still, he pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Hello?" he called, rapping on the cabin door. "Anyone home?" The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of damp earth and old wood hit him immediately. The room was cluttered with strange objects, animal bones carved into intricate shapes, jars filled with dark, viscous liquids, and piles of gold coins that gleamed in the faint light. Clive's eyes widened at the sight of the gold. "Jackpot," he muttered, stepping inside. "Looking for something, are ye?" A voice rasped from the shadows. Clive spun around, his heart pounding. Ephraim Crow stood in the doorway, his face twisted into an unsettling grin. His eyes, bright, unnatural green, glinted with a predatory gleam. I didn't mean to intrude," Clive stammered, stepping back. Ephraim chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Oh, but ye did, and now you'll pay the price." Before Clive could react, Ephraim's form began to change. His wiry frame twisted and shrank, his features morphing into something monstrous. His face grew sharper, his skin taking on a sickly greenish hue. His hands, now clawed, flexed with unnatural strength, and his grin widened to reveal rows of jagged yellow teeth. Clive stumbled backward, his legs refusing to move fast enough. "What are you?" he gasped. Ephraim's voice was no longer raspy, but high-pitched and mocking. "Ah, lad, ye found the truth, haven't ye?" "I'm no hermit. I'm one of the old ones, a keeper of secrets and gold, and you've come where you don't belong." Clive tried to run, but the cabin seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening. The floor turned to blackened earth and roots snaked up to entangle his feet. Ephraim, or whatever he truly was, cackled as Clive fell to the ground, his screams swallowed by the dark. When Clive didn't return, a search party was organized. They found his mule tethered to a tree near Shadow Creek, but of Clive himself, there was no sign. The cabin, too, was gone, as though it had never existed. All that remained was a clearing filled with scorched earth and an eerie silence. In the years that followed, the story of Clive Mathers and Ephraim Crow became legend in Cedar Hollow. Some said the hermit was a leprechaun, a creature of cunning and malice who lured the greedy to their doom. Others claimed he was a forest spirit, a guardian of ancient treasures that mortals were never meant to find. But one thing was certain: Shadow Creek was no place for the uninvited. Even now, nearly a century later, the story endures. Hunters and hikers who venture too close to Shadow Creek report strange occurrences. The sound of laughter echoing through the trees, glimpses of a wiry old man with unnatural green eyes, and on rare occasions, the faint glint of gold buried in the forest floor. And those who dare to take the gold, they're never seen again. In the dense wilderness of Newfoundland, where fog rolls in thick and silent from the Atlantic and forests stretch unbroken for miles, there's a rocky expanse known as Muirhaven. It's a place few dare venture, a barren landscape dotted with gnarled trees, jagged cliffs, and moss-covered stones. The locals speak of the area in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay far away. For beneath the stones and soil of Muirhaven lies something no man should seek: the gold of the Leprechaun. In the spring of 1932, a man named Aidan Sheehan came to the area looking for work. He was a wanderer, moving from town to town, taking whatever jobs he could find to keep his belly full. When he heard stories of gold hidden in the Muirhaven rocks, guarded by a malevolent leprechaun, he dismissed them as the superstitions of backward country folk. But the promise of treasure, no matter how absurd, was too tempting to resist. One foggy morning, armed with a spade, a lantern, and his wits, Aidan set out for Muirhaven. The journey was arduous. The path twisted through dense forest and over uneven ground, the fog so thick it felt like a living thing, curling around Aidan's legs and muffling every sound. By the time he reached Muirhaven, the sun was hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the landscape stretched before him in eerie stillness. Aidan set to work, prying up stones and digging into the earth. He searched for hours, his frustration mounting as he found nothing but damp soil and broken roots. Just as he was about to give up, his spade struck something hard. His heart raced as he knelt to dig with his hands, uncovering a small wooden chest bound with iron bands. The chest was heavy, its lid carved with intricate designs. Aidan pried it open, and his breath caught. Inside was gold, more than he could ever have imagined. Coins, jewellery, and other trinkets gleamed in the dim light, their surfaces unmarred by time. "Jackpot," Aidan muttered, a grin spreading across his face. He reached for the chest, but before he could lift it, a voice cut through the silence. "Not so fast, lad." Aidan froze. The voice was high and lilting, with a sharp edge that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Slowly he turned, and his blood ran cold. Standing atop a nearby rock was a figure no taller than a child, clad in a green coat and a weathered hat. Its skin was pale, almost grey, and its face was sharp and angular, with a hooked nose and a mouth that curled into an unsettling grin. But its eyes were the most terrifying, glowing green and filled with an intelligence that was both ancient and cruel. The leprechaun hopped down from the rock, its boots clicking softly on the stones as it approached. "You've found me gold, haven't ye?" it said, its grin widening. "But it's not so simple as taking it and walking away." Aidan's mouth went dry. "I didn't mean any harm," he stammered, stepping back. "I'll leave it. I won't take anything." The leprechaun laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Ah, but you've already disturbed it, lad, and that means there's a debt to be paid." Aidan's heart pounded as the leprechaun circled him, its grin never faltering. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't want trouble." "No trouble," the leprechaun said. "Just a wager, a chance to win your freedom." Aidan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but the leprechaun's glowing eyes held him in place, their light mesmerizing. "What kind of wager?" he asked. The leprechaun clapped its hands, and a twisted game board appeared on the ground between them, its surface marked with strange symbols. "A simple game of wit and chance," it said. "Win and ye go free. Lose." It leaned closer, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "And ye stay." Aidan's mind raced. He didn't trust the creature, but he knew he had no choice. "Fine," he said, his voice firm. "Let's play." The game was unlike anything Aidan had ever seen. The leprechaun explained the rules quickly, its words fast and slippery, hard to follow. As they played, the creature's demeanor shifted, growing more intense, more predatory. Aidan did his best to keep up, his every move met with the leprechaun's mocking laughter. Hours seemed to pass. The fog growing thicker, the air colder. Aidan's hands trembled as he placed his final piece on the board, hoping against hope that he'd won. The leprechaun's eyes narrowed as it studied the board. Then, to Aidan's astonishment, it laughed. "Well, well," it said, leaning back. "It seems you've got a bit of luck in you after all." Relief flooded through Aidan. "So I'm free?" he asked. The leprechaun's grin returned, but this time it was sharper, crueler. "Aye, free to go," it said, "but there's one last thing." Before Aidan could react, the leprechaun snapped its fingers. The gold in the chest burst into flames, the heat searing and sudden. Aidan stumbled back, shielding his face as the fire consumed the treasure in seconds, leaving behind only ash. The leprechaun stepped closer, its burning eyes fixed on Aidan's. "Gold is never free, lad," it said. "Not in this world, nor the next. Remember that." With that, the creature vanished, leaving Aidan alone in the fog. He stumbled back to the village, shaken and empty-handed. When he told the villagers what had happened, they listened with grim expressions. None doubted his tale. They had heard it all before. Aidan left the village the next day, vowing never to return. He spent the rest of his life haunted by the leprechaun's eyes, by the echo of its laughter, by the knowledge that he had played a game with something far older and darker than he could comprehend. And in Muirhaven, the gold still waits, buried beneath the stones, guarded by the leprechaun. The Curse of Blackthorn Hollow. The village of Blackthorn Hollow lay nestled in a forgotten corner of Ireland, surrounded by rolling green hills and forests so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was perpetually damp, and the people who lived there carried an air of quiet unease, as though the weight of something unseen bore down on them. At the heart of the forest, hidden among gnarled trees and twisted roots, was a place no one dared to go, a clearing said to belong to the wee folk. For centuries, villagers had avoided it, heeding warnings passed down through generations. Stay out of the hollow and leave the gold alone. Most obeyed, but every now and then someone let greed blind them. Those who ventured into the hollow seeking its treasures were never seen again. One cold autumn, a man named Ewan O'Connell arrived in the village. He was a stranger to Blackthorn Hollow, a drifter who claimed to be looking for honest work. The villagers eyed him with suspicion. He was tall and wiry, with a sharp jawline and a gaze that seemed too calculating. But Ewan was charming, and before long, he had ingratiated himself with the locals, trading stories in the pub and earning their trust. It was in that same pub one stormy night that Ewan first heard the tale of the gold in the forest. An old man named Fergus, deep in his cups, muttered about the treasure buried in the hollow. Hidden by the wee folk, Fergus slurred, his eyes glassy. But cursed it is, ye take their gold and they take your soul. Ewan chuckled, but his curiosity was piqued. Wee folk, you say? Leprechauns? Aye, Fergus whispered, leaning in as if the very mention of them might summon something dark. You'll know him by his eyes, green as poison and burning like fire. He'll trick ye, lad, and once he has ye, there's no coming back. The villagers fell silent, the air in the pub thick with tension. Ewan looked around at their grim faces and laughed. You're all daft, scared of fairy tales. The barkeep leaned forward, his face pale. It's no fairy tale, lad. Best ye forget what you've heard and stay out of that forest. Ewan smirked, but said nothing. That night, as the storm raged outside, he lay in his rented room, turning the tale over in his mind. He didn't believe in curses or leprechauns, but the thought of gold hidden away in the forest was irresistible. By morning, he'd made up his mind. He'd find the hollow, take what he wanted, and leave this superstitious village behind. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the groaning of trees swaying in the wind. Ewan followed the directions Fergus had muttered the night before, pushing deeper into the woods until the sunlight faded and the air grew colder. The farther he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, the branches clawing at his clothes like grasping fingers. Finally, he found it, the clearing. It was smaller than he'd imagined, surrounded by ancient trees that twisted unnaturally toward the sky. In the center was a moss-covered stone circle, and within it a patch of bare earth. Something about the place made Ewan's skin crawl, but he brushed it off. He'd come too far to turn back. The ground was soft beneath his boots as he stepped into the circle. He began to dig, his hands trembling despite himself. The first handful of dirt revealed a glimmer of gold. His heart raced as he uncovered more. Coins, more than he could count, gleaming despite the faint light. They looked old, impossibly old, but he didn't care. Gold was gold. As he stuffed the coins into his satchel, a chill ran down his spine. The forest had gone silent. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then he heard it, the sound of laughter. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more shrill, echoing all around him. Ewan froze, clutching the satchel to his chest, his eyes darting around the clearing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. The laughter stopped, replaced by the crunch of leaves behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only shadows and the oppressive darkness of the forest. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, small and hunched, darted between the trees. "Show yourself!" Ewan shouted, his voice rising in panic. The figure stepped into the clearing. It was no taller than a child, dressed in tattered clothes that might once have been fine. Its face was gaunt, its skin pale and waxy, and its eyes, bright, burning green, gleamed with a malevolence that sent a bolt of terror through Ewan. "You've taken what's not yours," the creature said, its voice high-pitched and dripping with malice, "and now you'll pay the price." Ewan backed away, clutching the satchel as if it could protect him. "Stay back," he shouted. "I'll give it back, all right? I don't want any trouble." The leprechaun tilted its head, its grin widening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Oh, but trouble's found ye, lad, and it's too late to turn back." The shadows around the clearing seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. Ewan tried to run, but the ground beneath him shifted, roots bursting from the earth to wrap around his ankles. He fell hard, the satchel spilling open, coins scattering across the ground. The leprechaun approached slowly, its grin never faltering. "Greedy, foolish man," it hissed. "Did ye think ye could steal from me and walk away unscathed?" Ewan clawed at the roots, his screams echoing through the forest. The last thing he saw was the leprechaun's burning eyes, glowing brighter as the shadows consumed him. Days later, the villagers found the clearing. The stone circle was undisturbed, the patch of bare earth untouched, but they found no sign of Ewan, only his empty satchel and a single gold coin resting on the ground, glinting faintly in the dappled light. No one spoke of what happened. No one ventured into the hollow again. But on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees, some claim to hear faint laughter echoing through the forest like a warning. The leprechaun's gold remained buried, waiting for the next fool to take the bait. The Keeper of Hemlock Ridge. In the shadow of the coast mountains in British Columbia, there's a place known as Hemlock Ridge. To most, it's just another stretch of dense forest, rugged trails, and cascading streams. But to the few who call the area home, it's a place avoided after dark, a place whispered about in uneasy tones. The ridge, they say, is cursed, a haunt for those who don't know better. And at the center of it all is the tale of the Keeper. The year was 1929, and Hemlock Ridge was a booming area for logging and mining. Men worked from sunup to sundown, carving a path through the wilds for progress. Among them was Nathan Shaw, a prospector with a reputation for pushing boundaries. Nathan was ambitious, bold, and reckless, qualities that made him successful, but also unpopular. He didn't care for rules, especially the ones steeped in local superstition. One chilly October evening, Nathan was sitting in the corner of a small tavern in the nearby town of Pine Hollow, listening as the locals told stories of the keeper of Hemlock Ridge. According to them, the keeper was an ancient creature, part man, part spirit, tasked with guarding treasures hidden deep within the woods. Gold, they said, lay buried beneath the ridge, but it wasn't free for the taking. "Ye touch the keeper's gold, and you'll pay with your soul," muttered an old trapper, his voice trembling as he downed a shot of whiskey. Nathan rolled his eyes, his impatience with their fear clear. "You're all scared of a children's tale," he scoffed. "Gold's gold. If it's there, I'll find it, and no ghost or goblin's going to stop me." The barkeep leaned forward, his face pale. "It's not just a tale," he said quietly. "The forest doesn't forget. People who go digging where they shouldn't, they don't come back." Nathan smirked. Maybe they just didn't know what they were doing. Ignoring the uneasy glances from the other patrons, Nathan finished his drink and left. By morning, he'd packed his tools and set off for the ridge, determined to find the treasure the townsfolk were too frightened to claim. The climb to Hemlock Ridge was steep and treacherous, the forest thick and alive with the sounds of birds and rushing water. But as Nathan ventured deeper into the woods, a strange stillness began to settle over the area. The birdsong faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves that sounded too deliberate, too rhythmic. The air grew colder, the towering hemlock trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. By the time he reached the ridge, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting a fiery glow over the treetops. Nathan set to work quickly, using his pickaxe to dig near a cluster of moss-covered rocks. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he figured if gold was buried here, it wouldn't be far beneath the surface. Hours passed, and Nathan's frustration grew. He dug deeper, his muscles aching, until his pickaxe struck something hard. His breath caught as he dropped to his knees and began scraping away the dirt with his hands. A chest emerged, its iron bands rusted but intact. His heart raced as he pried it open. Inside was a trove of gold coins, their surfaces gleaming despite the dim light. Nathan laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet forest. "Fools," he muttered, "all that fear for nothing." His laughter died in his throat as a sound reached his ears, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around him. Nathan froze, his hands still clutching the gold. The forest, which had been silent moments before, now seemed alive with movement. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, and the rustling leaves grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" Nathan called, his voice shaky. The growl came again, closer this time. Nathan scrambled to his feet, the chest of gold forgotten. From the shadows stepped a figure, its form shifting unnaturally as it moved. At first it looked like a man, but as it stepped into the faint light, Nathan realized it was anything but. The creature was short, no taller than his chest, but its presence was enormous, oppressive. It wore tattered clothing that clung to its twisted frame, and its skin was pale and slick, almost like bark. Its face was grotesque, with sharp, angular features and a wide mouth filled with jagged, yellow teeth. But its eyes were the most terrifying, green as emeralds and glowing faintly in the darkness, filled with malice and glee. "You've taken what's not yours," the creature hissed, its voice high-pitched and cold. "And now the keeper will take something in return." Nathan stumbled back, his chest tightening as fear overwhelmed him. "Stay back!" he shouted. "I'll leave it, all right? Take the gold. I don't want it." The keeper's grin widened. "It's not the gold I'm after, lad." The forest seemed to come alive, the trees creaking and groaning as their roots burst from the ground. They twisted toward Nathan like serpents, wrapping around his ankles and pulling him down. He struggled, clawing at the dirt, but the roots held fast. The keeper approached, its burning eyes fixed on Nathan's as it knelt beside him. "Your greed has sealed your fate," it whispered. "Now you'll join the others who thought they could steal from me." Nathan's screams echoed through the forest as the roots dragged him beneath the earth. The last thing he saw was the keeper's grinning face, watching with cruel delight as the soil closed over him. When the townsfolk noticed Nathan's absence, they didn't bother searching for him. They knew where he'd gone, and they knew what had likely become of him. A week later, A hunter found his pickaxe near a cluster of moss-covered rocks on Hemlock Ridge. Beside it lay a single gold coin, its surface streaked with blood. The hunter left it where it lay and returned to Pine Hollow, sharing what he'd seen. The story of Nathan Shaw became another warning, another chapter in the legend of Hemlock Ridge. The gold remained buried, guarded by the keeper, waiting for the next fool to try their luck. Even now, on cold autumn nights, locals claim to hear faint screams drifting down from the ridge, mingling with the sound of rustling leaves and low, guttural growls. And in the forest, the keeper waits, his burning eyes watching from the shadows. The borrower in the walls. In the heart of Nova Scotia, in an aging Victorian home that had stood for over a century, something stirred in the walls. The Blackwood house had always carried a dark reputation, its previous owners either vanishing or abandoning the property under mysterious circumstances. Locals whispered about strange noises at night, soft tapping, a faint chuckle, the rustling of something small and unseen. But the house had remained empty for years, waiting for the next fool to step inside. That fool turned out to be Declan Moore. Declan was a practical man, a historian with no patience for ghost stories. He had spent his career travelling to forgotten places, documenting history before time swallowed it whole. When he purchased Blackwood House for a fraction of its worth, he saw an opportunity, a chance to restore a piece of Nova Scotia's past and turn it into a quaint bed and breakfast. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house was old, yes, but sturdy. He spent his days scraping layers of paint from the walls, uncovering the home's original architecture, and cataloguing the history that had been buried beneath decades of neglect. But as the days turned to weeks, something began to gnaw at his nerves. Things went missing. At first it was small objects, his house keys, a screwdriver, a silver dollar he had kept on the windowsill. Then, stranger things vanished. The sugar bowl from the kitchen, a candlestick from the dining room, an entire floorboard from the attic. Items disappeared without a trace, only to reappear in odd places days later. Declan found the sugar bowl balanced on a high shelf, the candlestick wedged into the gap between the stairs. It was infuriating. One night he awoke to a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. It was coming from the walls. Rats, he told himself, or maybe a raccoon had gotten into the crawl space. He'd call an exterminator in the morning, but the tapping wasn't scurrying or scratching. It was deliberate, calculated. Then came the laughter, a low, whispery chuckle that slithered through the dark. Declan's breath caught in his throat. He held perfectly still, waiting for the sound to come again. Minutes passed, silence. Perhaps he had imagined it. But the next morning, another item was missing. His grandfather's pocket watch. Determined to put an end to whatever was happening, Declan scoured the house. He checked under the floorboards, inside the walls, even in the air vents, but found nothing. The watch was gone. That night, the tapping returned. Only this time, it was closer. Declan lay in bed, gripping the sheets, as the sound came from inside the wall right next to him. Tap! 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 The laughter followed, soft at first, then growing bolder. It was coming from inside the house. Something was inside the house. Declan bolted upright, snatching the flashlight from his nightstand. He shone it along the wall, half expecting to see a crack or a hole where an animal might have burrowed through. Instead, the wallpaper was pristine. Then, slowly, the pattern of the wallpaper shifted. A face emerged. It wasn't like anything Declan had ever seen. It was small, with sickly pale skin and deep-set green eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the flashlight's glow. Its mouth was impossibly wide, full of yellowed, uneven teeth. And it was smiling. Declan stumbled back, barely suppressing a scream. The face disappeared, melting into the wall as if it had never been there. The next morning, Declan left the house and drove straight into town. He found himself at the local pub, a place where old-timers gathered to share news and tell tall tales. When he mentioned Blackwood House, the bartender gave him a long, unreadable look. "You've seen him," the man said. Declan hesitated. "Seen who?" The bartender wiped a glass with a rag, his gaze dark. "The borrower." Declan frowned. "Borrower?" "Aye," an old man at the bar muttered. "That's what we call him. A leprechaun, but not the kind you read about in books. He's been in that house longer than any of us have been alive. He takes things, small at first, then bigger. He starts with objects, then moves on to people." Declan scoffed. "You're saying a leprechaun is stealing from me?" "Not stealing," the old man corrected. "Borrowing. There's a difference." Declan shook his head, ready to dismiss the nonsense, but the bartender's voice stopped him cold. "You still have your shadow?" Declan blinked. "What?" The bartender leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Check." Something in the man's tone sent a chill down Declan's spine. Slowly, he turned to face the wall where the dim lantern light flickered. His shadow should have been there, but it wasn't. Declan's breath hitched. He turned back to the bartender, panic rising in his chest. What does that mean?" The old man sighed. "It means he's almost done with you." Declan wasted no time returning to Blackwood House. He stormed inside, flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. He had to find whatever was hiding in the walls and get rid of it, whatever it took. The moment he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. The house fell into darkness. Then came the tapping, faster this time, urgent, surrounding him. Tap, tap, tap. Declan's grip on the crowbar tightened as the laughter rose, spilling from the walls, the floors, the very air itself. Then the voice came, whispering in his ear. "You borrowed my gold, so I borrowed something of yours." A terrible cold seeped into Declan's bones. He turned in a frantic circle, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just shadows. Then, in the dim glow of his flashlight, something shifted in the mirror. His reflection was smiling. Declan wasn't. He lifted his hand. His reflection did not. A horrible realization crashed over him. He wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at him. The borrower. The thing in the mirror grinned wider, stepping forward. Declan tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. His limbs locked, his breath stilled. The mirror wavered like water, and the last thing he saw was himself being pulled inside, his scream cut off as the glass sealed shut. The next morning, the Blackwood house was empty. No sign of Declan, no disturbance. Just the old Victorian standing quiet and undisturbed, waiting for the next tenant. Weeks later, a new owner arrived, eager to restore the house. On their first night, as they unpacked, they noticed something odd. The reflection in the mirror seemed just a second too slow, and in the walls something tapped and laughed. The road to nowhere. The highway stretched for miles, cutting through the dense wilderness of northern Ontario like a forgotten scar. There were no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life beyond the endless sea of trees pressing in on either side. It was the kind of road where help was never close, where cell reception faded into static, and where things could happen without anyone ever knowing. Caleb gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as the rain poured in sheets against the windshield. The wipers fought a losing battle against the storm, barely clearing enough visibility to see the road ahead. "You're sure this is the right way?" Rachel asked from the passenger seat, her voice tight with unease. Caleb shot her a look. "It's the only way unless you want to backtrack another 100 miles. In the back seat, their friends Mark and Jess whispered to each other, both wrapped in a shared blanket. The cold had crept in ever since the storm started, and even with the heater blasting, the chill refused to leave the car. Then, without warning, bang! The car jerked violently. The steering wheel wrenched in Caleb's hands as the vehicle swerved, the tires skidding over slick pavement. A sickening grind came from beneath them before the car groaned to a complete stop. Silence. "What the hell was that?" Mark asked, his breath visible in the cold air. Caleb exhaled sharply. I don't know. He turned the key. The engine whined, coughed, then died. The dash flickered once before going black. Perfect, Rachel muttered. Jess pulled her coat tighter. So, what now? Caleb checked his phone. No service. There's got to be a town or something close, Mark said. I mean, we've been driving for hours. Rachel looked out the window. I don't see any signs, no gas stations, nothing. Maybe we passed something back a ways. Caleb grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. Let's walk. Someone's got to be nearby. The four of them stepped out into the storm, the rain immediately soaking through their clothes. The trees loomed high on either side of the road, their gnarled branches twisting in the wind. They walked and walked. But the highway stretched on in endless darkness, the road swallowed by fog. Then they saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering through the rain like a dying ember. A sign. The Hollow Oak Inn vacancy. It stood at the end of a dirt road just off the highway, nestled in the trees like it had been forgotten by time. The sign creaked as it swung in the wind. The building itself was old, its wooden frame dark with age. The windows were black, no movement inside, but the light was on. Mark exhaled in relief. See? Told you we'd find something. Rachel hesitated. I don't like this. Jess hugged herself. We don't have a choice. The four of them climbed the porch steps, rain dripping from their clothes, and Caleb knocked. At first, nothing. Then the door creaked open. An old man stood in the doorway, his face shadowed under the dim lantern light. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked over each of them before he stepped aside. Get in, he said. Caleb hesitated. We. The man cut him off. Get inside, now. Something about his voice sent an instinctual warning through Caleb's body, but the cold and exhaustion won over. They stepped inside. The inn was old, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something rotting. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper curling at the edges. An old chandelier flickered weakly above, its bulbs casting strange shadows. The old man shut the door, bolting it. You shouldn't be here, he muttered. Rachel stiffened. Excuse me. The man turned, his eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear. It knows you're here now. Jess frowned. Who? What? The man took a step closer, lowering his voice. It watches from the woods, from the cracks in the walls, from the dark places people forget to look. Mark scoffed. Okay, crazy old man, can you just point us to a phone? The man's eyes locked onto his. There's no phone, no power, and no way out once you've been seen. Then the scratching started, low and rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. The sound came from the walls. Rachel turned sharply. What was that? The old man's face darkened. It's already inside. The scratching grew louder. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Something laughed. Not a full laugh, just a quiet chuckle, just on the edge of hearing, slipping between the cracks of the room. Jess gasped, pointing toward the far wall. A hole, just large enough for something to be watching. The scratching moved, faster now, crawling inside the walls, circling them. The laughter followed, rising and falling like the tide, soaking into the very air. Then a whisper, low, raspy, and full of glee. Ye shouldn't have come here, little ones. The hole widened. Something moved inside. A shape, a face, pressed against the darkness. The skin was pale and wrinkled, with deep-set green eyes that burned with unnatural light. The mouth stretched too wide, grinning. Rachel screamed. The walls shook as the thing inside moved, shifting between spaces that shouldn't exist, slipping between cracks that weren't there moments ago. Run, the old man whispered. The room exploded. The walls burst open, sending splinters flying as something small, but horribly wrong, lunged from the darkness. It was short, no taller than a child, but its limbs were too long, its fingers curling like talons. The green coat it wore was tattered, and its hat, once fine, was now soaked in something dark. Its teeth were yellow and jagged. It laughed. You've come to take what's mine, have ye? The creature rasped. Caleb ran. They all ran, crashing through the door and into the storm, sprinting down the road as the creature's laughter followed, echoing through the trees. The Hollow Oak Inn disappeared behind them, swallowed by the fog, as if it had never been there. The road stretched endlessly before them, no signs, no buildings, just the empty highway. And then Caleb stopped. The car was there, right where they had left it. The engine hummed softly, the headlights cutting through the rain. Rachel gasped. How? They didn't ask. They didn't look back. They just got in. As Caleb turned the key, a voice whispered from the dark, right next to his ear. I'll be seeing ye soon. And in the rearview mirror, the smiling face watched from the trees.